Hello and welcome back to Kimber's Film Notes, where I am exploring the legal subtext of pop culture and film history. We've been exploring film history from the invention of the film camera, and now we're up to the golden age of Hollywood. And today I'm continuing the story that was started in the last video where we looked at the studio system and the fall of the studio system. Today we're talking about the fall of the star system, which was very much intertwined with the studio system. And we'll be looking at the fall of this system through the lens of two iconic classic Hollywood starlets, Bette Davis and Olivia de Havilland. My hope for this video is that by looking at these two women's stories and their fight against the studio system of classic Hollywood, that you will walk away with a better understanding of contracts and just how powerful they can be. If we're going to define the star system, it is essentially a studio-controlled model where actors were created into these marketable personas that were then used to sell the movies that they were in. So at the time, movies oftentimes weren't even screened. They were sold based on the actors that were in it. And if you had a big star like Bette Davis or Olivia de Havilland, Humphrey Bogart, all our favorite iconic classic Hollywood actors and actresses, they had such star power that people would just buy the package of movies that was being sold to them from the distributors. That was that. So star power really was influential in selling the movies and distributing them to theaters. So the heart of the star system is going to be the personal service contract. At the time, these were long-term, very oppressive and restrictive contracts that locked actors and actresses into the studios that they worked for. We can refer to contracts like these as golden handcuffs because they offered actors and actresses opportunity and stardom and fame, but with all of that came the cost of their freedom. These personal service contracts essentially allowed the studios to have near total control over the stars. How they justified this was the studios at the time, and if you go back to my last video where we really did a deep dive into the studio system, remember we had the major Hollywood studios, the big five, and then the minor three. They were able to justify these very restrictive contracts because they invested a lot into their actors and actresses. And when I say a lot, I mean literally every aspect of their life. We're talking they invested grooming advice, physical fitness, vocal coaching, hair, makeup, clothing, anything that had to do with really branding the stars that they had to continue the success of the movies. That's what they invested in. And so, according to the studio's point of view, having these very oppressive contracts protected that investment that they put into these stars. The services of these performers were considered unique, and that's going to be a very important point when we get into the contractual side of these legal cases that came up with Bette Davis and Olivia de Havilland. So let's dive into these two iconic female actresses and the legal cases that helped to bring down the star system. We're going to start with Bette Davis. Yes, the Bette Davis, the Margot Channing from All About Eve, the iconic role that she's still known for today, that really gets to the heart of competition in Hollywood and how it can be an assembly line of talent. Once you hit a certain age or you get to a certain point in life, the upcoming actresses and actors rise to the top and take their place, which can be a very cruel and cold experience. We'll put it like that. Bette Davis was also known as the fourth Warner Brothers because of the case we're about to get into. She often fought a lot with Warner Brothers regarding her contract. She frequently fought for equal and higher pay. Many of the male counterpart actors that she worked with, whether they were a supporting actor or an extra, they were often paid more than she was, and she was known for fighting against this and pushing back and really bringing any frustration she had to light with the Warner Brothers. At the time that this case happened, she had just won an Academy Award, and As most people would expect when you're rising the ranks in your job, whether it's in Hollywood or in corporate America or wherever, the more experience you get, the more successful you get at your job, it's understandable and commonsensical that you would want to raise, right? You would want more challenging responsibilities, better titles, all of the things that you would expect with climbing the ladder. And Bette Davis was no different. She wanted more challenging roles. She wanted that higher equal pay that we just discussed. And coming off the back of winning an Academy Award, that was the perfect time to advocate for those things in her contract. However, Warner Brothers, they refused to renegotiate, and because of that, she refused to star in their latest film, God's Country and the Woman. At the time, she was still under contract, and so she decided to escape. And I believe, if I remember correctly, when I was researching this, she escaped to Canada first to try and avoid being served papers. And then ultimately she went to London because there was a production going on there that she really wanted to star in. And so Warner Brothers initiated what would become the lawsuit we're going to discuss, Warner Brothers v. Nelson. That happened in London, and essentially the whole case looked at the contract. The fact that she was still within the contract term, so it hadn't expired yet, really defeated her case. She wasn't able to make the argument that she doesn't have to perform. Essentially, this was a breach of contract, meaning she failed to perform the promise that she made to Warner Brothers. Something that is important to note here, though, kind of harkening back to those suspicious and monopolistic tactics that studios were using in the studio system. There were multiple terms written into the contracts with actors and actresses that made them so oppressive. And one of those were the suspension and extension clause, where essentially any time an actor or actress paused their contract or asked for time off, or they weren't actually doing work, they weren't filming a movie, that time was tacked on to the end of their contract. So let's say that I sign a contract with a Golden Age Hollywood studio, hypothetically speaking, for a year. Let's say I have one project at the beginning of the year and one project at the end of the year with 3 months of no work in between. Those 3 months would get tacked on at the very end. That is how the studio interpreted these contracts. What this resulted in practically are very long contracts, and something you learn, it was the first thing that was brought up in law school, is that courts really don't like having to enforce personal service contracts usually, because in our Constitution, it is unconstitutional to have personal servitude. And having a personal service contract where someone is locked into it and time is just being tacked on to the end over and over and over again, essentially locking them into an indefinite contractual term of personal service, that sounds a lot like servitude. Another important note, when we're discussing contracts and especially breaches of contracts, the solutions that are often offered to remedy this are referred to as remedies. There's multiple remedies that a court can give to try and make a person who had a contract that was breached by a non-performer to make them whole is something you'll hear a lot. A few of the types of remedies, there is specific performance, meaning that the non-performer is required to perform. There's also awards of monetary damages. This is usually what you'll hear, where they'll try and calculate an ascertainable figure. It has to be ascertainable for it to be considered a damage. It can't be speculation. And the idea is that you're looking at what should have happened during the course of the contract, and you're trying to give that a monetary amount to give to the non-breaching party to make them whole. And the third is issuing an injunction, which is essentially requiring someone to stop doing something. In this case, the court issued an injunction. Davis couldn't appear in any other productions outside of Warner Brothers for 3 years or for the remainder of her contract term, whichever is less. Why? Because Warner Brothers had already invested in unreleased films with her, and her appearing elsewhere could devalue them. That was the argument that Warner Brothers made to the court, and the court at that time sided with Warner Brothers. And you're probably wondering, well, why didn't they require specific performance if that's a remedy? Well, going back to that concern of requiring someone to actually perform a personal, non-delegable service is how it's referred to, that's really hard to enforce. You can't tie Bette Davis up and bring her to the Warner Brothers lot and force her to perform. So even though specific performance is a remedy that is available, it's incredibly hard to enforce, and there's a lot of concerns when it comes to freedom of the person to work and act on their rights. It's just very concerning, and courts are going to be very careful to assign specific performance for that reason. Now, this case is considered a loss because she lost procedurally. However, this case set up for the major win that would really change the star system going forward and impacting Hollywood even to today, and that was the case with Olivia de Havilland. But before we get to that, I just want to touch on what impact did Warner Brothers versus Nelson actually have. So in the aftermath of that case, this was the first time that Warner Brothers actually looked at their contracts and considered this particular clause where they were tacking on extra time at the end of their actors' contracts, that they were starting to reconsider whether they should include that. However, they didn't really implement this, at least as a common practice, until the aftermath of Olivia de Havilland versus Warner Brothers. So fast forward 8 years, Olivia de Havilland, who was actually a friend of Bette Davis, de Havilland got her iconic role in Gone with the Wind. She was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress in that. She was also an actress with Warner Brothers. Now, at the end of her contract with Warner Brothers, she thought she was done. Even though de Havilland's 7-year contract, 7 years, by the way, that's a long time. Just want to really emphasize it's 7 years long. At the end of her 7-year contract, Warner Brothers comes to her and says, nope, you have to perform and work for 6 more months. And remember, when we say 6 more months from the perspective of a studio, we're talking about 6 more months of actual work. Let's say she signs on to a project to honor this, hypothetically, and she has one project that's 2 months, another project that's 2 months, and then there's 4 months in between. That, even though they're tacking on 6 more months, those 2 projects would only be 4 months total. So she would still have to serve 2 more months of actual work. And there's no telling how long that would actually result in her continuing to work for Warner Brothers after the expiry of her personal service contract with them, just based on the way that their industry works and working on film sets. So she sued, much like Bette Davis. However, a key difference is that with Bette Davis, she was still within her contractual term, the original one, not the tacked on time. And with Olivia de Havilland, her contract had actually expired, but Warner Brothers was coming back and saying, no, you have to serve 6 more months for us. And so the issue at the heart of this case was, does 7 years mean 7 years of actual work or 7 calendar years? Warner Brothers argued for the former, but the California Court of Appeals disagreed. They ruled that under California law, personal service contracts cannot exceed 7 calendar years, period. The court emphasized public policy. People should be free to change employers or their careers, and these types of personal service contracts, especially the practice of extending and suspending work so you can tack on more time at the end, really restricts people's ability to do that, to change jobs, to change employers. In a nutshell, this case changed everything, and the Paramount case I discussed last time actually happened a few years after this case. And so you have this case that really just kind of uprooted the practices between studios and their starlets contractually. And then you have the Paramount case coming in and saying that studios can no longer monopolize the film industry. And so the downfall of the star system kind of heralds in this new era of freelancing and non-exclusive contracts between actors and actresses and studios. As a result, there was a power shift from the studio to talent agents and their agencies, and we'll talk about more of that later when we get up to speed. But before we go, I want to end this video with my golden age movie favorites, some recommendations that I would give to anyone who is wanting to get into more older films, black and white films. So many people see black and white films as being boring, but I promise you, the more that you watch, it's so interesting to see how the movies we have today, the cliches, the typecasting, just the plots that we've grown to know and love, get their start in classic Hollywood. So a lot of the movies I'm about to recommend, as you watch them, they will feel familiar because these are the plots that became iconic and made the way for the film industry that we have today. To begin, if you want to explore the golden age of Hollywood, I recommend It Happened One Night. This was made in 1934. It has Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert. It's comedic. It's amazing. The famous scene where she's hailing a taxi is incredibly iconic. My next recommendation, My Man Godfrey, which was made in 1936, starring Carole Lombard and William Powell. Fantastic movie. I love it because, again, it's a rom-com, but at the same time that it's a rom-com, I feel like this particular movie had a very obvious undertone of social commentary where the point of the film, without spoiling anything, is William Powell actually plays a down-and-out beggar who ends up being hired as a butler in a very rich, well-to-do household. And so the expectations of someone in a butler position in a very rich household versus being on the streets as a beggar boils to the surface as certain relationships are developed with William Powell's character. Next, we have Love Affair, with the plot twist of all plot twists for romance films, starring Irene Dunne and Charles Boyer. Charles Boyer is one of my favorites. I came across a few of his movies last year for the first time. Gaslight and History is Made at Night, which is coming up next, and I'll explain why in a moment. I would say Charles Boyer is to the golden age of Hollywood what Fabio is to contemporary romance novels. At least that's how I would define him. His movies, especially this one, Love Affair, again, another iconic plot twist. If you've ever seen When Harry Met Sally, an amazing modern day rom-com, I believe there's a scene in this movie where they reference Love Affair. And so again, this is a good example of a movie, an early black and white movie that was just so beloved and so well done that even now it's become an archetype for rom-coms. Next, we have one of my new favorites. I watched this for the first time this past December and proceeded to watch it 3 more times in the same week. History is Made at Night, starring Jean Arthur and again Charles Boyer, and this one was made in 1937. Fantastic movie. It has action, it has love, it has comedy, it has New York and Paris, and a really great plot twist. I would say this was so far one of the first movies that is more of a romantic comedy, but that has a disaster sequence in it that actually made me gasp when I was watching this because I just wasn't expecting it in an older movie like this. I'm still in love with it. I will probably watch it multiple times a year for the rest of my life. It's just so good. It's got so many great one-liners in it. So if you're only going to watch one recommendation from this list that I'm giving you, although I think you should watch all of them, please at least watch History is Made at Night. And then finally, I do also want to make some suggestions for my fellow film history nerds. If you really want to see what early films looked like when they were just discovering and playing around with the film camera, they are not long at all. The first 2 are actually really, really short. They're just like a few seconds long. And then the third one is an 18-minute film that I believe is actually on HBO Max. That's where I watched it for the first time. First one is The Horse in Motion, and then the second is Round Hay Garden Scene. These are some of the first actual film clips that we still have from the late 1800s, very early 1900s when this technology was being developed. A Trip to the Moon by Georges Méliès is the 18-minute film I just discussed. It's such a funny little silent film. It's sci-fi, and so the premise of it is you have these scientists exploring how to get to the moon. And again, it's funny how over 100 years ago, they're experimenting with storytelling with this technology, and we still have similar expectations of how we think a story should be told via the camera. And so if you're interested in silent film and really seeing what early films looked like, I highly recommend those three as a starting point. So there you have it, my movie recommendations and how Bette Davis and Olivia de Havilland helped to change and break down the star system. Eventually, the rise of television, which I'm going to cover in the next episode, changed the industry once again, and please tune in for the next one. If you like this content, subscribe, drop your favorite Golden Age film in the comments. Stay tuned for part 3.